This is a presentation about one-name studies, which is a form of genealogical study which looks at a single surname and its variants. Maybe like me, you're fascinated by surnames. This slide shows the top 21 surnames in use in Britain today. But where did they come from? What do they mean? Why do we have surnames at all? Well, most date from the 13th and 14th century, although Wales and Scotland were somewhat further behind in their adoption. It was caused by an expanding population and the need for men to prove inheritance from their father. And with the increase in bureaucracy at the time, you needed some kind of positive medieval ID. The problem was compounded by the rather poor selection of Norman forenames at the time. By the end of the 14th century, half the male population shared just 5 first names: Henry, John, Richard, William and Robert. So many instances by names such as John the Tailor were used, but these of course were not necessarily inherited from the father. It was the adoption of inherited surnames that were the answer to the problem. There are all different types of surname in use today in Britain. Let me just point out 3 of the main groups. First of all, the patronymics, like Johnson and Richardson, which derive from the name of the father, although as you can see here, not all of them use the son suffix. Then there's the locative surnames. These fall into 2 types: topographical, which are named after a particular location feature, such as Hill or Townsend, and the toponymic, which are actually named after the village or town concerned, such as Stepney, Helmsley and Beckham. The third group is the occupational surnames, the well-known ones of Smith, Baker, Wright, Fletcher and so on, which take their names from the profession that the father would have had. So what is a one-name study? A one-name study is a project researching all occurrences of a surname and its known variants, as opposed to the more traditional genealogy, that is, where you try and find your particular ancestry and create a pedigree, or try and study the descendancy of maybe some famous person. This means that one-namers are going to be researching the genealogy and family history of people with the same surname, whether or not they are related to them. This seems rather odd to a number of people. What makes us want to do this? Most people seem to move into one-name studies almost by accident. Perhaps you were researching your family history or that of your spouse and you got stuck. You hit that brick wall. But you noticed other occurrences of the surname, either nearby or in some other place, and you felt that if perhaps you collected all those references, something would eventually fall into place. Or possibly you advertised your surname interests, and respondents then inquired about people outside your own family, and perhaps you helped them by exploring these people, because after all it may come in handy, if only to eliminate them from your own inquiries as to whether they're part of your own family. Or maybe you're just one of those people that need to prove or disprove the story that you know we're all related. Or maybe you're looking for that elusive ancestor who is said to have connections to the aristocracy, or money left in chancery, descended from the Huguenots, born on the wrong side of the bed, or a combination of all these reasons. After a while, all these different people and groups seem to become your family after all, and at that point you've been bitten by the one-name bug, and you might well join the guild in order to share your unusual activities with other addicts. Now, guild-registered studies aren't for everybody. Some one-namers may restrict their research geographically, perhaps to one country or one region, but true one-namers collect all occurrences worldwide as far as the availability of data allows them to do so. The Guild only accepts worldwide one-name studies for registration, although anyone with an interest in one-name studies is welcome to become a member. My own one-name study is looking at the Hollier name and its variants. It comprises a lot of paper, even more paper, lots of books, a whole heap of digital records, and a very large website. So what are the differences between a one-name study and what one might call ordinary genealogy? Well, as we've seen, they have different objectives. Instead of trying to find all your ancestors, or all the descendants of some great dynasty, the object is to discover things about the surname and all the people that have held it. What are we trying to discover? Well, certainly we might try and find the origin, or the earliest references we can find to the name. We might try and look at what the meaning of the name is, although you may have to refer to academic experts to help you in this. You'll certainly want to look at the relative frequency of the name, because that determines the kind of study you're going to take on. You'll be looking at the distribution of the name in geography and time, including the patterns of immigration and emigration. And you'll be looking at name variants and what we call deviants, which I'll come back to. Let's look at the distribution across geography and time. One useful source is the 1881 census and Steve Archer's Surname Atlas program. He himself is a guild member. In the case of my study, you can show a normalised distribution of the name across poor law unions, and the darker colours certainly show up the most prominent places where the family were. But it doesn't really highlight where the name came from, and indeed you might even think there's a major concentration of the name in North Wales, but in fact that was just one family, a large family, on holiday in North Wales at the time of the census. A better approach is using Steve's other program, GenMap, and using it to plot data from the IGI of all parishes with 2 or more events in, that is, a birth, marriage or death. By restricting it to 2 or more, we get rid of a lot of the rogue mistranscriptions. And here you can begin to see some interesting things, that there certainly is a focus of the name in the West Midlands, and yet there are also early references in the south of England that seem to show no particular pattern. So what about the variants and deviants? The 3 variants that I study are shown here on the left, Hollier, Hollier and Hollier. But I have to cope with a number of other odd spellings that turn up due to mistranscriptions, either because the clerk at the time couldn't hear what was being said, or misread what was being said, or more modern transcriptions carried out by people on another continent not used to our handwriting. And indeed, if you look at the signature of Joseph Hollier on the left here, you can see why a number of people might think that it was spelt ending in OR. It's only when you look at the same character in the word Joseph that you realize we're seeing an E, because this is the way that the E was written into the so-called secretary hand. But it's very easy to make these transcription mistakes. And indeed I have a number of problem variants, in that there are several other quite valid separate surnames that can create problems and confusion with the Hollier name. Luckily for me, Hallier is generally found in Gloucestershire, Hellier in Devon, Hillier in Dorset, Hullier in Cambridgeshire, and Ollier in Cheshire and North Staffordshire. And because of that, I can generally distinguish them from the genuine Holliers that tended not to be in those counties. So what else are you going to find in a one-name study? Well, along the way you're going to find some very notable people who have held the name, and they'll all have fascinating stories. Maybe they'll have heraldic connections, coats of arms. And you'll attempt as far as possible to do family reconstruction, that is, to try and pin all individuals down to a particular family tree. although it has to be said this is not compulsory as part of a one-name study, and indeed for the very largest studies this would become almost impossible to do. There are other differences from ordinary genealogy as well. If you're carrying out a guild study, it'll be worldwide in scope, whereas few of us doing our own personal ancestry have that problem. There'll be lots of data collection, and potentially every source is potentially relevant. Doesn't matter what it is, if you see a surname indexed record, you'll look up your name. One-name studies are also what I call divergent rather than convergent. With ordinary genealogy, you're probably trying to find the next ancestor in the line from where you currently sit. So you'll be looking at maybe hundreds of potential people and trying to converge on the one individual who was the ancestor in question. So it's a convergent process. But with one-name studies, you may come across an instance of the name in a place or a country where you hadn't expected it, and this causes you to go off in completely divergent directions, studying other aspects of the name in places you hadn't yet covered. Now, unlike ordinary genealogy, proving relationships is not necessarily a barrier. With our own family history, we're always told you've got to prove each relationship one by one as you go back. But with one-name studies, this isn't necessarily important if you're not trying to reconstruct the families. And this means there's a difference in the relative value of original data and what I call metadata, or data pointing to data, such as indexes. Few one-namers can afford to buy all the birth certificates, for example. They will rely on the birth indexes. If you have a very rare name, then it'll be a very small one-name study, and indeed they may turn out to be just a single family. And in my own ancestry, I have 3 rare names, Iddins, Danbrook and Fortington, all of which turn out to be a single family. Studying such names is of course not very different from ordinary genealogy. With the very biggest studies, however, family reconstruction is less practical, and more emphasis will be placed on other generic information about the name. So many members of the Guild find that it's medium-sized studies that they prefer. Another factor is that if you have a very small study, very few people will ever inquire about it. If you have a very large study, you may get deluged by inquiries, but because of the less detail you're collecting, you may not be able to help them so much. You also need to remember that the relative frequency of names can change over time. The 24th most common UK name today is Patel, but there were none in 1881. However, generally speaking, for what I call the UK-centric names, the 1881 census can give a good pointer to the relative size of the study. And I've created a categorization system based on that population so that I could name a one-name study as being anything between tiny to extra large, depending on the number in the 1881 census. And you can see some of the data here on typical names falling in these categories. My own surname of Walker would certainly be an extra large study, and only a tiny number of Guild members would ever tackle such a study. However, as we can see, there are a few brave individuals, but on the whole, most Guild members look at small and medium-sized names. But all this talk of the UK, we mustn't forget the rest of the world. So while there were 596 Holliers in the UK in 1881, there were 113 in the US at that time, but interestingly, none of them descended from the British ones. They all came from a family from France. In Canada at the same time, there were none, but that was to change over the next 20 years. So how do you go about starting a one-name study? Well, as we've seen, many people end up starting a one-name study almost by accident. But to the extent you make a conscious decision to start one, the first thing to do is to establish the size of the study, because that will determine its character. Consider which surname variants you're going to look at, because there's nothing more dispiriting than having collected a lot of surname references to have to go back and look at them again because you've forgotten a variant. You need to think about the coverage of the study. If the name is particularly common, in America for example, you've got to consider the issues of there not being any national indexes of birth, marriages and deaths. Your next job will be to start on that mammoth task of collecting the basic vital records that form the key reference to your study: births, marriages and deaths. You may well want to collect entries from Family Search, the well-known website that incorporates the Mormon IGI. You'll probably want to collect National Census Index entries, as these really help group people into families. And then you need to consider and start researching the many other sources of information, or maybe even start a DNA study, which increasingly is proving to be a valuable adjunct to a paper-based study. But let me reassure you that it's not just about collecting data. In the Guild we recognise 7 aspects to a one-name study. We often call them the 7 pillars. Yes, there is all that data collection, but beyond that there's analysis, where you make sense of the data and start doing family reconstruction; synthesis, where you start drawing conclusions on the meaning, origin and distribution of the name, as well as the other activities, such as responding to enquiries, publicising your study so that other people know about it, publishing the results, which we strongly recommend you do, and also thinking about preserving your study for the time in the future when you're no longer around to carry it out. A word about responding to inquiries. Guild-registered studies are required to respond to email and reply paid inquiries. Now, many of these inquiries won't be interested in your one-name study, just whether you can help them with their own family history research, but a few may wish to assist. Which brings me on to the different types of one-name study you can have. Many one-namers are just a one-man band. Others have loose cooperation from a group of researchers around the world, which certainly helps in collecting references in other parts of the world. Those other people are recommended to join the Guild as well, but only one person can actually be the registered owner of the surname. You may go the whole hog and create a formal one-name society. The other thing to recognise, of course, is the Guild don't have a monopoly on one-name studies, and you will come across one-name studies being carried out outside the Guild. So what about the Guild? Well, it was formed in 1979 and is a registered charity. We have over 2,500 members carrying out over 2,200 studies and overall researching almost 8,000 surnames. And we have members from all over the world. What are the benefits of membership? Well, a huge amount. There's our award-winning journal for a start. We then hold seminars and an annual conference. There may be local meetings around the country. There's an excellent members handbook and an email forum where you can chat with other members and solve your problems. But there's too many to list here, so do have a look at our website to see in detail about all the benefits of membership. Perhaps, however, the biggest benefit is learning from each other, whether it's through meeting others at local meetings organised by your regional representatives, through the electronic Guild forum, or during seminars and other meetings, or just by reading experiences published in the journal. Gradually, as a one-namer, you should become the global expert on the surname. Because of that, you'll often reach conclusions that overturn previous thinking. For example, those surname dictionaries, with all their speculation and unproven early records. And indeed, the extent of your data may allow you to draw what I call negative conclusions. Because of the comprehensive nature of your records, you'll be able to tell some researcher that the person you're looking for must be this one, it can't be anyone else. So in conclusion, one-name studies can be very time-consuming. The initial data collection of birth, marriages and deaths can be quite arduous. But overall, such studies can be very rewarding and provide valuable insights into genealogy. You could help many researchers, and many of them may become new friends across the globe. So why not think about one-name studies and the Guild? Thank you very much for watching this video.